You've fallen in love. Unfortunately, it's 1853. That flutter in your chest? Best keep it to yourself. Your corset's digging in, your chaperone's 3 feet away, and your mother is already planning your engagement to someone else. This is Victorian Britain, where love is not a feeling. It's a complication. And expressing it? That could cost you your future, your reputation, or your place at the dinner table. Tonight, we're pulling back the lace curtain on what falling in love really meant in a society obsessed with silence, status, and proper sleeves. So settle in, loosen your stays, or just your expectations, and prepare for a story that's far less fairy tale, far more survival. And while you're here, most people just watch and disappear. Don't be one of them. Subscribe, and tell me where you're listening from. It's nice to be seen every now and then. You weren't supposed to notice, but you did. It was a borrowed book from your cousin's sitting room, or the way someone brushed your hand as they passed the bread. Or perhaps it was the stranger who tipped their hat just a second too long on a foggy London morning, and now you're haunted by the memory of their cheekbones. That flicker of feeling, that small, impossible thing blooming in your chest, that was your first mistake, because this is Victorian Britain, and feelings are only welcome if they're pre-approved, notarized, and expressed in the passive voice. No one tells you not to fall in love. They just make sure you're too busy, too watched, and too terrified to do anything with it if you do. It starts innocently. You're attending a modest gathering, not a ball. That would be too obvious. Something like a poetry reading hosted by a vicar's wife with questionable taste in lace. He's there, or she is, or they are. Whoever it is, they're not important yet. Just someone standing 3 bodies away, being perfectly unremarkable. But then, they laugh. And for a moment, the entire room rearranges itself around the sound. You pretend not to notice, because that's what's expected of you. Absolute composure. A Victorian heart should be silent, like a well-drawn curtain. You're not to be seen wanting, only waiting. Pleasantly. Properly. And so you wait. You wait while your stomach flips at the sound of their voice. You wait while your hand brushes theirs while reaching for the same pamphlet. You wait while the conversation drifts dangerously close to actual connection, and then retreats into polite nonsense about the weather and the wheat harvest. There are rules for how a feeling becomes a romance in this century, and the first rule is, it shouldn't start with a feeling. Romance is supposed to be arranged, preferably by 2 families with matching silverware sets. It's supposed to begin with an introduction through mutual acquaintances, a background check conducted by your mother, a discussion about property values, and then, if there's time, you can add affection, like a garnish. But sometimes, the feeling comes first, and that's where the trouble starts. Because there are no instructions for this kind of thing. No etiquette book that tells you what to do when someone makes your breath catch, and you're not wearing your best gloves. You weren't supposed to feel anything, and now you're replaying a look that lasted 2.3 seconds for the next 3 weeks. There's a reason Victorian love letters are so overwrought. When you can't speak plainly, everything becomes poetry. You don't write, "I like you." You write, "My soul is undone by your presence, and I find myself adrift in your absence." Because if you're going to risk emotional ruin, you might as well make it rhyme. And still, nothing happens. That's the thing about love at this stage. It isn't the kiss, or the proposal, or the scandal. It's the waiting. The aching quiet of not knowing if you're alone in the feeling, the slow burn anxiety of being unsure whether that glance was intentional or just a trick of the gaslight. If you're a woman, you definitely don't speak of it. You wait. You smile. You lower your eyes and pray he notices, without knowing that you noticed first. You're meant to be pursued, but not too enthusiastically. Flattered, but not forward. Interested, but never interesting. And if you're a man, you tread lightly, because if you mistake friendliness for affection, you'll be quietly ridiculed for a decade. And if you come on too strong, her father will have words with you, most of them legal. So, what do? You improvise. You angle your walking route just slightly, so you might pass them again by chance. You ask their cousin what novels they enjoy. You say things like, "I hear the frost will return next week," and hope they know it means, "Please say something that will keep me alive for another day." You start to see them everywhere. At church, in shops, in poems that were written before either of you were born. They become the lens through which the world sharpens, and they haven't even touched your hand. That's the beauty and the torment of falling in love in the Victorian era. It exists entirely in suggestion, in glances, in your sudden, unexplainable interest in visiting the bakers on Thursdays, in the way you start signing your name differently in case they ever see it, and you still haven't said a word. This is the danger of the flicker, that it ignites something you're not equipped to name, not out loud, not when someone could hear you, so you keep it secret. You tell your diary. You lace the margins of your sketchbook with initials. You hum melodies you think they'd like. And in your mind, it's already a love story, complete with tragic longing and forbidden desire. Because in this time, in this place, the most passionate part of love is when nothing has happened at all. And that's why it matters. Because in a world where everything is watched, the only place love is truly free is inside your own imagination. Society has already written your love story. Unfortunately, you weren't invited to the first draft meeting. There's a role for you, possibly a romantic one, but no one thought to give you any lines. You're expected to improvise, with grace, restraint, and an unspoken understanding of all the rules you were never officially taught. Welcome to Victorian courtship. It's not about who you fall in love with. It's about who your aunt approves of, who your father can tolerate, and who your dowry can reasonably attract. Your job, whether you realize it or not, is to make yourself look accomplished, agreeable, and ideally silent, while everyone else evaluates your suitability like a horse on auction day. The suitor is the applicant. You, my dear, are the resume. But make no mistake, you don't interview anyone. You are the thing being reviewed. Now let's talk about the rules. Because there are many, and none of them are printed anywhere respectable, you learn them the same way you learn to breathe in a corset, by watching the women around you and pretending it doesn't hurt. Rule 1. A lady does not express interest. You may smile, but not too widely. You may ask a question, but only about the weather, the roses, or Queen Victoria's latest holiday. You may not lean in. You may not appear eager. You may definitely not make the first move unless you'd like to be quietly blacklisted from every social event within 30 miles. Rule 2. Emotions are decorative, not functional. You may look wistful. You may blush modestly, but you may not show hunger, longing, or any desire more intense than your love for well-behaved lapdogs. If your heart pounds in someone's presence, you keep that information locked somewhere beneath your petticoats. Rule 3. Courtship is public performance. You are never alone with your intended, not even in a room with the door slightly ajar. There will always be a chaperone nearby, an aunt, a governess, a mother, or, worst of all, a little brother who reports everything. Your glances are studied, your posture is critiqued, and heaven help you if your laugh is too loud. Laughter is dangerously close to confidence. Rule 4. Men are supposed to lead. This would be fine if they actually knew where they were going. He may call. He may visit. He may write. You may not. Unless you wish to be discussed, and not in a flattering way. You're taught from girlhood that a good match is one that improves your position. Love is optional, and even then, it must arrive politely, dressed appropriately, and never before dinner. Now, if you are a man, congratulations. You have slightly more freedom and considerably more pressure. You are expected to choose wisely, pursue delicately, and never appear too desperate, even if you are. And if you come from a good family, your romantic fate was likely discussed at your christening. Your letters will be screened. Your intentions will be questioned. And no, you may not walk with her in the park unless her mother is also there, smiling benignly while mentally measuring your income. The entire system is built around pretense, polite lies told with great enthusiasm. She pretends not to notice your attention. You pretend not to notice that she noticed. Everyone else pretends this is charming. Here's a typical Victorian courtship timeline. Step 1. You are introduced, preferably at a ball or a garden party hosted by someone with a double-barreled surname. Step 2. You exchange pleasantries, nothing serious. Just deeply coded remarks about the weather that actually mean, please love me, I'm dying inside. Step 3. He calls at your house. You pretend to be surprised. Step 4. He sends flowers. You send a thank you note, handwritten of course. Step 5. After several weeks of stilted conversation under watchful eyes, he asks your father for permission to formally court you. Step 6. You begin to see him regularly. But still, never alone. That would be improper. Step 7. If everything goes to plan, he proposes. Step 8. You accept, or your mother accepts on your behalf. Romantic, isn't it? Of course, some people bypass the script. They eloped. They wrote passionate, semi-scandalous letters. They fell in love without asking permission. Most of them ended up exiled, disgraced, or quietly erased from family portraits. Because the script isn't just tradition, it's protection. Protection for reputations, for inheritances, for families who care more about legacy than happiness. You, sitting there, dreaming about passion and poetry, you're a liability. Unless your feelings happen to align perfectly with the marriage your family already planned for you, in which case, congratulations. You've achieved emotional alignment and property consolidation in one tidy package. But don't get too excited. Even if the courtship goes smoothly, even if both families approve, even if he's handsome and you're blushing in all the right ways, you still don't get to choose how this ends. Because in Victorian Britain, love is a luxury, and luxuries are reserved for people who already have everything else. So before you're forgotten again, do something small but loud. Subscribe and be heard. You're a parlor maid. He's your employer's son. You bring the tea. He doesn't see you, until one day he does. And now you're trying very hard to forget the way he said, "Thank you," as if it meant more than 2 syllables should. Or perhaps it's her. She's a seamstress with tired eyes and nimble fingers. You're the vicar's daughter, raised to be kind but not that kind. You linger when you deliver the hymn sheets. She smiles too long. And now you're wide awake at night, heart racing, with no hymn to explain it. This is not allowed. Victorian love stories have very clear instructions. You may fall in love if it's with someone from your class, your religion, your race, your gender expectation, and ideally, your cousin. Anything outside that, it's not romantic, it's reckless, it's foolish, it's dangerous, and yet here you are, betraying centuries of polite breeding by daring to feel something for the person you absolutely shouldn't. Let's start with class. Class is not a suggestion in Victorian society. It is a prison with good upholstery. If you are a servant, you do not look your employer in the eye. If you are a lady, you do not ask the stable boy if he read Wuthering Heights. If you are a shop clerk, you do not flirt with customers who wear gloves you could never afford. Class is everything, and crossing it is worse than being poor. It's being presumptuous. It's forgetting your place. But sometimes, you forget anyway. He sees you reading a book while polishing the brass, and asks what you think of the ending. She touches your wrist while taking your measurements, and neither of you move away fast enough. The connection is tiny, but it's real. It's rare. And now it's unbearable. You pretend it's platonic. You absolutely must. You bring the tray with the same blank expression. You speak with the proper distance. You go back to your room and stare at the ceiling, replaying the conversation that technically never happened. Because even if you did nothing wrong, you've already done too much. Love across class wasn't just frowned upon. It was considered immoral. It was seen as a disruption to the natural order, as if the universe had aligned everyone in perfect rows, and your heart came in with a broom and messed it all up. If you're poor and fall for someone rich, you're called an opportunist. If you're rich and fall for someone poor, you're declared mentally unwell. There are entire laws, social rituals, and economic barriers designed to make sure people like you don't end up with people like them. But it's not just class. It could be religion. You're Protestant, they're Catholic, or Jewish, or dissenting, or just not Christian enough for your aunt to stop whispering. Falling for someone outside your faith wasn't just a scandal. It was an offense against your entire lineage. Interfaith love meant family exile, social ruin. It meant explaining yourself at every dinner for the rest of your life. And if that wasn't complicated enough, there's gender. You're a woman, and you've fallen for another. You're a man, and you can't stop thinking about someone you were taught never to see that way. There are no words for this kind of love in polite society, only medical diagnoses and whispered gossip. So what do? You pretend. You become a master of coded language. You drop books and hope they pick them up. You quote poetry and letters to mutual friends. You stare just a little too long and then look away like it never happened. And all the while you wonder, do they know? Do they feel it too? Or are you just projecting your entire soul onto someone who still doesn't know your middle name? Every moment is electric and entirely silent. You can't tell your family. You can't tell your friends. Even your diary feels like a risk, so it lives inside you. It curls around your ribs. It keeps you awake at night and silent during the day. And then comes the dream. Not the sleeping kind, the waking one. The fantasy of what would happen if the world weren't watching. If you could walk down the street hand in hand. If they could kiss you in the garden without a scandal. If love could just be love. But this is not that world. This is not that time. This is Victorian England, where the wrong love can cost you everything. And still, you keep looking for them. In crowds, in letters, in borrowed books. Because deep down, the wrong person, the one you were told to avoid, to forget, to erase, is the only one who ever made you feel like yourself. And sometimes, the most forbidden love is the one that feels the most right. You can't say it. Not out loud. Not directly. Not even in a whisper behind closed doors. But it's there. Thick in your throat, heavy in your chest, hovering behind every polite smile. And so, like every repressed, romantic, and respectable society, you do the only thing that feels remotely safe. You write. Love, in Victorian England, often begins with silence and survives on stationery. You pick your paper carefully. Thick, ivory parchment if you can afford it. Pressed with lavender if you dare, you choose your ink. Not too bold, not too faint. Something that says, I feel deeply, but not, I'm desperate. Then you begin, slowly, cautiously, because every word could become evidence. You don't write, I miss you. You write, the days pass with a curious stillness in your absence. You don't say, I'm in love. You say, your presence lingers in my thoughts like the last light of a winter afternoon. And if you're feeling bold, you quote Tennyson, not because it's subtle, but because it gives you plausible deniability. Everyone quotes Tennyson. He's safe. Well, relatively. You fold the page precisely. You seal it with care. You address it in your neatest, most innocent script, and then you send it off with all the trembling hope of someone who's just flung their soul into the Royal Mail. And now, the waiting. Because here's the thing about love letters in the Victorian era. They're slow. And they're never entirely private. A housemaid might intercept it. A brother might read it aloud for sport. A parent might keep it as evidence of your poor judgment for the next 5 decades. Even the postman might get curious. So every time a letter arrives, you panic a little. Is it from them? Was it intercepted? Did you say too much? Not enough? Did you spell yours with just the right amount of longing? And when they finally write back, if they write back, you read it like it's sacred. Not once, not twice, at least 27 times, each with increasing suspicion. Was fondly just politeness? Did yours mean emotionally or just postally? Why did they underline soon? You analyze every comma as if it holds the fate of your future. You commit entire lines to memory. You carry the letter inside your sleeve like a secret weapon. You sleep with it beneath your pillow and pretend that's not completely unhinged. But what if they don't write back? That's the harder part. When the silence echoes louder than anything words could have said, you tell yourself they're busy. You tell yourself the letter got lost. You tell yourself anything to avoid admitting the one thing you can't bear to say. Maybe you were foolish. Because in this world, in this society, simply expressing a feeling is a risk. Putting pen to paper isn't just vulnerable, it's evidence of emotion, of rebellion, of wanting more than you were told you deserved. And when love fails to return the favor, you don't get closure, you get quiet. You tuck the letter away. You press it into a book of poetry and pretend you forgot about it. You nod along when your aunt mentions more appropriate matches. You smile politely at dinner. You go on, as if you weren't once trembling over a single page stained with ink and hope. But let's be honest. Love letters weren't always about response. Sometimes writing was the point. The one moment you could be honest, even if no one ever read it. It was where you could say what you couldn't in drawing rooms or under your governess's gaze. You wrote to preserve a feeling, to capture the ache before it faded, to say, "This happened, I felt it, and even if no one else knows, I do." And for some, the writing never stopped. There are letters historians have found that were never sent, bundles of pages hidden in trunks, confessing affection to people long gone, or long married, or long dead. Whole romances lived out in ink alone. There were lovers who carried letters to their graves, widows who wrote to husbands already buried, men who wrote to other men but addressed them as dear friend, so the household wouldn't question, women who wrote to each other and signed with initials, the safest kind of truth, because the world couldn't always know. But paper could be trusted, at least until someone burned it. And let's not forget the etiquette of it all. If a gentleman received a letter too forward in tone, he might hand it off to his sister for interpretation. If a lady received something inappropriate, she was expected to ignore it, or worse, return it unopened. There were entire advice columns on how to reject someone with style, via letter, without ever admitting you knew they liked you. But for the brave and the lucky, letters were the one place love was allowed to speak. Two people could build entire relationships across class or distance or expectation in the space between ink and silence. It wasn't always safe, it wasn't always smart, but it was honest. And in a world built on pretense, sometimes a few trembling words on folded paper felt like the only real thing. So you wrote, because you couldn't say it, because you weren't supposed to want it, because you were in love. And no one could take that away, unless they got to the letter first. Don't be like the others who read, feel, and vanish like they were never here. Hit subscribe, or stay hidden, like the letters they burned. Your first real affection isn't met with applause. There's no warm smile from your mother, no tearful hug from your governess, no toast at dinner celebrating your emotional awakening. Instead, you're met with silence, or suspicion, or if you're especially unlucky, a stern lecture about sensible attachments and ruining your prospects. Because Victorian society doesn't believe in first love, it believes in first mistakes, and yours is happening right on schedule. You're too young, too impulsive, too dreamy, too foolish to understand that feelings should be edited, timed, and ideally approved by at least 2 adults with land holdings. But none of that matters, because you've already fallen, and no one caught you. It starts innocently enough. Doesn't it always? He passes you a note folded 12 times too small. She saves a corner of cake just for you. You brush fingers in the church pew and pretend it was an accident. But your pulse knows otherwise. Suddenly the world is louder, colorful, unbearable. You notice things you've never noticed before. The way they smile sideways. The way your name sounds in their voice. The way time collapses when you're near them and stretches endlessly when you're not. It's glorious. It's stupid. It's the first time you've ever really felt alive. And it couldn't be more inconvenient. Because first love rarely arrives with good timing or reasonable expectations. It tends to show up in the middle of everything else. Exams, church duties, embroidery practice, and demands to be taken seriously when no one else will. You try to explain it to your cousin, to your journal, to your reflection, but no one understands. Not really. They say you'll grow out of it, that you're just infatuated, that your heart will change like the seasons, and this one will pass. And maybe it will. But right now, it's everything. You can't eat without thinking of them. You compose entire imaginary conversations in your head. You find yourself listening to love songs written decades too early and wondering if they somehow already knew your story. And then, the panic. What if they don't feel the same? What if they're only being kind? What if you've misunderstood everything and are now one romantic gesture away from absolute humiliation? Or worse, what if they do feel the same and it still doesn't matter? Because love in this era doesn't guarantee anything. Affection isn't a path to partnership. Desire isn't a valid excuse. Even mutual feelings have to bow to reality. Money, status, timing, permission. You could both be entirely, equally consumed and still end up walking separate aisles toward other people. And that's the quiet tragedy no one tells you about. Because first love, true, devastating, inconvenient first love, doesn't always die from lack of feeling. It dies from everything else. Your family might intervene. His might send him away. She might get married off. You might be told to stop embarrassing yourself. You might obey. But the ache lingers. It shows up in places you thought were safe. A song lyric, a scent, a slip of the tongue. You hear their name and your stomach still flinches, even years later. You tuck their letters away, or you burn them, or, most likely, you do both. You say you've moved on, but part of you never really left. Because first, love changes you. It rearranges the furniture in your heart so that nothing else quite fits the same way again. Even when you fall again, and you probably will, you compare it. Is this the same? Is this safer? Is this realer? Or just more acceptable? You learn not to get too close, too fast. You keep a little distance between your hope and your face. You love quieter now, with caution, with clauses. And still, you remember. The first time they said your name and it sounded like a secret. The way their coat smelled. The precise shape of their handwriting. You remember thinking, this is it. This is the person. This is the story. Nothing will ever be the same. And you were right. It wasn't. Because even if they're gone, even if nothing ever came of it, first love leaves a blueprint, a softness, a wound, a lesson you didn't ask for but will never quite forget. So no, it wasn't applauded. It wasn't welcomed. It wasn't even considered appropriate. But it was yours. And for a moment, it was everything. You're not flirting. You're performing. Everything is rehearsed. Everything is watched. Everything, from the tilt of your head to the length of your reply, has already been done by generations of women before you. Victorian courtship isn't a conversation. It's a ritual. A slow, stifling dance performed in full costume, under surveillance, with an invisible score everyone but you seems to have memorized. Where you sit matters. Facing the light is better. It softens your features. Too close to the window and your complexion might look sallow. Too far from your mother and people will talk. How long you speak matters. 5 minutes is appropriate. 10 minutes is forward. 15 minutes? You'd better be engaged by tomorrow or prepared to pack your things. What you say doesn't matter as much as how you say it. You could be discussing the weather, a novel, or the price of oranges. But your tone should always carry a delicate whiff of polite enthusiasm without revealing any actual desire. And then there's the chaperone. She sits just close enough to hear, just far enough to pretend she isn't listening. She has the memory of a hawk and the patience of a woman who's seen this all before. You smile. You tilt your head. You offer him your glove. Not to keep, of course, just to examine the stitching. That's what you tell yourself anyway. because you can't say what you feel, not directly. So you learn to speak in code, a glance, interest, a dropped handkerchief, invitation, a slightly too long pause before responding, absolutely devastating yearning. Even your gloves have a language. Wearing one glove means you're receptive to conversation. Dropping your gloves entirely might be an accident or a very subtle proposition. Sending someone gloves as a gift? That's practically shouting in public. You exchange books, borrowed, always borrowed, and hope they notice which passages you've underlined. You quote poetry with just enough ambiguity that your father can't object. You avoid "I love you" and say things like, "The days are more agreeable in your company." And they understand, because they're performing too. Everyone is performing. He arrives in his best coat, which he borrowed from a cousin because his own is too shabby. He rehearses his compliments. He memorizes which flowers mean devotion and which ones scream desperation. The whole thing is exhausting, but necessary, because if you break the script, you risk everything. A laugh too loud, you're uncultured. A glance too bold, you're improper. A comment with too much wit, you're a problem. You walk a tightrope between appealing and invisible, charming but not too charming, attractive but not sensual, available but not eager, interesting but not opinionated, sweet but not dull, innocent but not clueless. It's like trying to fall in love while solving a math problem with your eyebrows. Even sitting has meaning. You cross your ankles, not your legs. You perch on the edge of the chair, never lounge. You keep your hands in view. You don't fidget. You don't touch your face. It shows nerves. You don't touch him, ever. Unless he offers his hand to help you out of a carriage, and even then, you wear gloves. The worst part? The feelings are real. You're genuinely excited when he walks in. Your pulse actually quickens when he laughs. You look forward to these 5-minute glances across the drawing room more than you've looked forward to anything in your entire over-supervised life. But it all has to look like nothing, like pleasant conversation, like politeness, like you're simply two well-bred people discussing the difference between asters and dahlias while your entire future trembles in your chest. And everyone's watching, the chaperone, the maid, your cousin who will absolutely tattle, the family friend who once caught you staring too long and has never forgotten it, your mother, who is both deeply invested and deeply disapproving at the same time. You're under constant review. Every gesture is measured. Every interaction is interpreted. One misstep, and the gossip begins. She's too bold. She's too forward. She's throwing herself at him. She thinks too highly of herself. She'll never get a proper match if she keeps behaving like that. So you adapt. You learn to say everything without saying anything. You build a relationship out of scraps. Shared books, faint smiles, a few lines of poetry. And then you go home and feel alone, where it's safe. But the feelings are there, whether anyone acknowledges them or not. They're in the way your hand trembles when he brushes past you, in the breath you hold every time his name is mentioned, in the part of you that hopes, against all good sense, that this 5-minute conversation might be the start of something real. Because love in the Victorian era wasn't about freedom, it was about choreography, and behind every delicate gesture and every perfectly worded reply was a person hoping, quietly, invisibly, to be loved back. So don't just vanish like you were never in the room. Subscribe to the channel, or keep applauding a world that never saw you. Maybe you're already promised to someone else, or maybe they are. It doesn't matter who said yes first or who stayed silent the longest. The point is, you meet them after the contracts are drawn, after the rings are discussed, after you've practiced your new signature and learned to smile when people congratulate you. And then, there they are, at a dinner, in a bookshop, on a train you almost didn't catch, looking at you like you're not just someone's future, but someone they should have found sooner. You laugh too easily. They tilt their head when you speak, like they've never met anyone who thinks the way you do. You find yourself staring just a moment too long. They notice, and now you both know. It's too late. Victorian society doesn't make space for timing errors. It values order, reputation, and punctuality. You marry when you're told. You love who you're given. You keep your longings quiet, and your regrets quieter still. But timing doesn't care about etiquette. You can meet someone 5 minutes too late and still feel it in your chest like a thunderclap. You can realize, with a kind of sick clarity, that this is what love was supposed to feel like, and it's already been assigned to someone else. So you carry on. You nod politely when they pass. You speak cautiously, if at all. You never sit too close. You never meet each other's eyes when someone else is watching. But you feel it, in the way they hold the door just a little longer than necessary, in the way your name sounds different in their mouth, in the silence that stretches between you, full of everything that will never be said aloud. You both learn to speak in code, not the poetic kind, the kind made of glances, small nods, shared silences. You say, "I hope your fiancé is well," and you mean, "I wish you weren't." They say, "You seem happy," and they mean, "Tell me it's not true." You laugh, you leave. You lie awake that night staring at the ceiling, replaying everything that almost happened. Victorian love stories rarely include the almosts. They don't talk about the people who arrived a season too late, the ones who made you feel something you'd already been told to bury. But they existed. They wrote long letters that were never sent. They gave lingering looks in carriages and at church pews. They carved each other's initials into places no one else would see. And then they married other people. Because that's what you were supposed to do. Marriage, after all, is a duty. Love is a complication, especially when it's not conveniently timed. Sometimes you convince yourself it didn't matter. You tell yourself it was fantasy. You tell yourself they probably weren't thinking about you in the same way. And you try, desperately, to believe it. Because what else can you do? You can't leave. You can't explain. You can't unravel a web that your entire family, estate, and reputation are tangled in. So you carry on. You host dinners. You smile in portraits. You write polite thank you notes. You build a life that looks exactly like the one you're supposed to have. And in the quiet moments, you remember. You remember the laugh, the way they said your name. That one evening in November when your hands brushed under the table and neither of you moved away. And that's where it lives now. Not in reality, not in letters, not in scandal or betrayal, just in memory. A locked drawer in the back of your mind that you only open when the house is quiet and the wind is just right. Because what happens next never really happened. It only could have. And in some ways, that's worse. You will grow older. You'll speak fondly of the past. You'll say things like, "I was quite silly when I was young," and no one will know that what you meant was, "I almost fell in love, and I never quite recovered." You'll tell yourself you made the right choice, because in Victorian society, the right choice is the one that doesn't cause trouble. But part of you will always wonder, what kind of trouble you might have been brave enough to survive. You're a woman. You have feelings, but no vote, no property, no legal control over your own body, and certainly no final say in who you get to love. In Victorian society, your heart is your least important asset. Your dowry speaks louder. Your surname speaks louder. Even your stitching ability might carry more weight. You don't get to choose. He chooses, or his family chooses, or your family negotiates and then informs you that you've been chosen. You smile. Because not smiling would be a scandal, and scandal ruins prospects. And ruined prospects mean fewer choices, which, let's be honest, you never had much of to begin with. Still, somehow, you love, even when you know the odds are against you. You fall for someone not because it makes sense, but because something in your chest stirs when he walks into the room, because your thoughts wander when they shouldn't, because your life, dull and dictated, suddenly has one unpredictable corner. You don't plan it, you don't announce it, and you definitely don't act on it, at least not openly, because acting on it means risking everything. If he returns your feelings but decides you're not suitable, he can walk away. You'll be branded with suspicion for years. If he kisses you before the paperwork is signed, you're ruined. If he whispers affection but never marries you, you're the one who looks desperate. He'll go on to marry someone else. You'll go on to be whispered about in hallways. And still, you hope. You stand by the window a little longer when he's due to arrive. You wear the blue ribbon he once complimented. You let your hand linger an extra breath when passing him the sugar spoon. Small rebellions, tiny declarations, but never anything loud enough to echo. Never anything that can't be denied. Because the minute you speak plainly, the minute you ask for clarity or worse, reciprocation, you lose. Now you're forward. Now you're inappropriate. Now you're the reason things didn't work out. So you play the game, knowing you're not holding any cards. Not the legal ones, not the financial ones, not the social ones. If he decides to marry someone else, he can. If your father promises you to a man twice your age with political connections, he can. If your fiancé turns cruel and controlling after the engagement, you're advised to be patient and count your blessings. Because your role isn't to choose love. It's to accept it when it's offered, and to endure it when it's not. This isn't about heartbreak. It's about helplessness. It's knowing that even when your heart is certain, the rest of your life is not yours to arrange, that your affection is real but powerless, that your feelings don't open doors, they just decorate the inside of a locked room, and still, despite everything you love, you carve space for it. Between the embroidery and the afternoon tea, between the expectations and the silences, you find moments where you can think of him, of what might have been, of what might still be, if the stars shift, if the families agree, if fate decides to be generous for once. You cling to novels because they offer outcomes you aren't allowed. You memorize lines of poetry because they speak with the boldness you can't afford. You watch his hands when he isn't looking. You learn to live on scraps, a glance, a smile, a sentence shared at a crowded gathering. You collect them like heirlooms. You know it may never amount to anything. You know the odds are against you. And yet you love, because the alternative is to become what they want. Quiet, resigned, grateful for whatever crumbs affection might trickle down from the right match. You love knowing you might lose, knowing you probably will, knowing that history won't remember your feelings, only your alliances. But love is stubborn, even when you've been taught not to need it, even when it brings more risk than reward. So you tuck it inside yourself, where it's warm and hidden and entirely yours. Because in a world where women can be traded, silenced, married off, and rearranged, love, unspoken and unpermitted, is your final act of agency. It may not give you power over your future, but it gives you something else, something they can't chart or price or marry off. It gives you yourself. And sometimes that has to be enough. You share a boarding room with another woman. Your beds are so close they nearly touch. You pass each other the wash basin. You braid her hair when she's tired. She warms your hands when they're cold. You never say the word, but something pulses underneath the silence, steady and soft and unspeakable. Everyone calls it close companionship. That's the phrase used in polite society, a nice fuzzy umbrella for what nobody wants to examine too closely. You know better. You both do. She looks at you like she's memorizing. You laugh too long at her jokes. When she brushes past you, it feels like lightning under your skin. The quiet kind. The kind that hums for hours. You tell yourself it's nothing. Just deep affection. Just friendship. Just the kind of bond women were allowed to have in a society that refused them everything else. And then one night, your fingers touch in the dark. Neither of you moves away. Nothing is said. Nothing needs to be. This is Victorian England, a time when love is allowed only in certain directions, under certain names, within strict, suffocating lines. Two women living together isn't questioned. It's even encouraged. They call it economical. They call it devoted companionship. They say, "How lucky you are to have such a close friend." And so you exist in the in-between. Not quite lovers, not quite platonic, not quite safe, but together. It's the same for the men. He writes letters to his dearest friend, and they stretch on for pages. He saves each one in a ribbon-bound box under his bed. They see each other once a month, maybe twice, long enough to speak without words, to walk with shoulders brushing, to sit in silence that says more than anyone else would tolerate. And when asked, they laugh. He's just an old friend from school. Everyone nods, nobody presses, because to press would be impolite. To see it would require admitting something uncomfortable, and the Victorian world avoids discomfort like the plague. So these relationships are permitted in plain sight, so long as no one says the truth aloud, as long as it stays wrapped in coded language and practiced ignorance. Because friendship in this context is the perfect disguise. It explains the intimacy. It justifies the closeness. It gives you room to breathe, as long as you don't breathe too deeply. You learn the rules quickly. Don't linger too long. Don't write too boldly. Don't stare when others might notice. Keep your letters sealed. Keep your hands to yourself. At least in daylight. Keep your stories straight. But behind the curtain, behind the lace gloves and borrowed books, something real grows. It's not performative. It's not strategic. It's not respectable. It just is. There's no marriage contract, no inheritance, no approval. There's only feeling and fear. Because if someone does name it, if a parent or employer or neighbor calls it out, that's it. You could be dismissed, banished, marked as deviant, locked away, sent to a doctor who thinks desire is a disorder, forced to marry someone, quickly, quietly, just to prove it was all a misunderstanding. So you learn to act. You speak of her fondly, but not too fondly. You use vague words, dear, comfort, attachment. You stop yourself from saying her name out loud when you're not alone. You learn to live in subtext, to master the art of glancing without being obvious, to love in footnotes and ellipses, and you're not alone. Historians will later dig up letters, poems, diary entries, some destroyed by relatives, some burned by the writers themselves, some miraculously preserved. And they'll try to decide, was it love or friendship? As if the difference is always legible, as if people fit neatly into boxes, as if longing requires a witness to be real. But the people who lived it, they knew. They didn't need permission. They didn't need a modern label. They just loved, quietly, bravely, carefully. Because the world was not made for them, but they existed anyway, in boarding houses, in private gardens, in letters signed with initials, in glances across dinner tables, in rooms with one bed and no explanations. And you learned how to keep it hidden, not because it was shameful, but because the world was. Because the real shame was a society that taught you that love only counted if it wore a certain costume, that affection needed paperwork to be valid, that your happiness was less important than your obedience. But somehow, you made a life out of the in-between. You made it beautiful. You made it sacred. You made it last. And even if history tried to erase you, even if your story was rewritten or left out entirely, you were there, and you loved. You trusted him, and why wouldn't you? He looked at you like you mattered. He said all the right things. He stood close enough to make you believe it was safe. And for a moment, it was. Until it wasn't. Victorian love doesn't guarantee safety. In fact, it almost never does. Because behind the lace curtains and the pressed waistcoats lies a society that punishes love when it steps even 1 inch out of line. You weren't married yet. You kissed him anyway. You wrote him something too honest. You let him into your heart, or worse, your room. And then he left. No explanation, no apology, just a cold silence and a sudden engagement announcement in the Morning Chronicle. To someone more appropriate, more presentable, more useful, or worse, he stayed. He married you, and then, slowly, day by day, became a stranger in your own home. The soft voice turned sharp, the attention became control, the charm faded, and the man who once quoted poetry at your doorstep now criticizes how you pour the tea. In either case, the result is the same. You're alone, but now you're also ruined. Because Victorian society didn't offer the luxury of heartbreak. It offered scandal, gossip, social exile. If you fell too far too fast, there was no safety net, no second chance, no sympathetic shoulder that wouldn't also be watching to see if your corset came undone. And if you got pregnant, the world didn't see a mother. It saw a mistake, a failure of character. A cautionary tale. You might be sent away to a cousin in the country, or to one of those quiet houses where women stayed until the child was born and then vanished. You'd reappear months later, pale and polite, with nothing to show for your absence except a new layer of silence. If you kept the baby, you'd be called unfit. If you gave the baby up, you'd be called heartless. There is no version of this story where you win, because scandal clings to women like wet linen. It shapes how people see you, and eventually, how you see yourself. The man, meanwhile, he might get a scolding. He might have to marry you if someone important finds out, or, most likely, he walks away untouched. Boys will be boys, they say. He was led astray. He made a mistake. You, however, are the mistake. Even if nothing happened, even if the only thing you ever did was fall in love too publicly, too obviously, too sincerely, your name is now associated with impropriety. That's enough. No one says it to your face. They don't have to. They say it with the way they lower their voices when you enter, with the invitations that stop arriving, with the new girl at church who's suddenly more suitable to sit beside. Your worth begins to erode in real time, not because you changed, but because the illusion of perfection cracked. And once that illusion is broken, it's nearly impossible to repair, so you become smaller, quieter, more careful. You start calculating each smile, each word, each interaction. You disappear in plain sight, because being seen is now dangerous. Being remembered is worse. You think about the women before you, the ones no one talks about anymore. The cousin who vanished after a summer romance. The maid who left in the night. The neighbor whose engagement was called off, and whose name is now only mentioned in whispers. You understand them now, because once love turns to ruin in the Victorian era, your life splits. There's before, and there's after. Before, you were hopeful. After, you are strategic. Before, you wrote his name in the margins of your journal. After, you rip out those pages in case anyone finds them. Before, you believed feelings could lead to something beautiful. After, you believe they're a liability. You learn to live on the outside of your own life, to perform normalcy so convincingly that even your own reflection is fooled. Because to survive scandal, you must become what people want to see, even if that person no longer exists. The tragedy isn't that he left, or that he changed, or even that the world believed his side of the story. The tragedy is that you believed you were safe, that love, somehow, might shield you from the rules, that honesty and longing might be enough. They weren't. And so now you retreat. You stop writing letters. You avoid eye contact with strangers. You let your mother reintroduce you to men with better reputations. You fold yourself back into acceptability and pray no one remembers the version of you that once reached for something more. But of course, you remember. You remember the moment it all turned, the letter unanswered, the meeting that didn't happen, the morning your name was replaced by someone else's in the conversation. You carry that memory like a bruised apple in your pocket, tender, hidden, never quite rotting away. And sometimes, late at night, you wonder what might have happened if you hadn't loved him, if you'd been colder, if you'd been wiser, if you'd been someone else entirely. But you weren't. You were just young, hopeful, human. And in the Victorian world, that was enough to break you. He promised he'd write, and for a while he did. You clutched each letter like it was oxygen, folded it neatly, reread it often, traced the ink with your fingertips as if that could bring him back. He'd gone to sea, or war, or South Africa for trade, or maybe just to London, which might as well be another planet if you're a girl from Derby with no train fare and a strict mother. He said he'd be gone a few months. It's been longer. But you're loyal. You're Victorian. You understand that real love requires patience, devotion, and endless embroidery while you wait. You keep a box under your bed with everything he sent, a pressed flower from Portsmouth, a folded sketch of a harbor, a single glove he accidentally left behind, and the letters. Always the letters. At first they came every week, then every month, then silence. You check the post twice a day. You invent errands near the gate. You convince yourself the delay is due to weather or illness or poor roads. Certainly not because he's changed his mind. You defend him, to your friends, to your mother, to yourself. He's just busy. He probably hasn't found paper. It takes time for boats to cross the channel, you know. But privately, you begin to reread. Not for comfort, but for clues. Looking for the moment he started drifting. Was it the shorter sentences? The lack of yours always? The way he stopped signing with a kiss? You told yourself you'd wait. You never asked how long. And now you don't know how to stop, because you were taught that loyalty is a virtue, that waiting is noble, that love is proven by endurance, even if you're the only one still enduring. And so you perform it. You don't accept invitations to dances. You avoid the nice boy at church who always carries your hymn book. You refuse to consider new matches because you're spoken for, even if the person who spoke has since gone quiet. Other women are praised for marrying well. You're praised for being faithful. You start to notice that the praise sounds suspiciously like pity. And eventually, someone tells you, casually, kindly, that he's married now to someone he met abroad. She comes from money. She travels well. She writes poetry that makes it into magazines. You nod. You smile. You say you're happy for him. Then you go home and take the box out from under your bed. You don't burn it. Not yet. You just tuck it farther back. And maybe you wait a little longer. Not for him anymore. Just for the hope that someone else might make you feel something similar. Eventually. Maybe. But you never really stop wondering if he meant it. The promises. The compliments. The future you sketched out together in whispered conversations and ink-stained letters. You don't get closure. Victorian women rarely do. Men move on. Women wait. And while the waiting might not kill you, it leaves a mark. A dull ache when certain names are mentioned. A reflex to check the post even when you know nothing is coming. A habit of reading old letters as if they might end differently this time. You start to talk about him less. People stop asking. You learn to smile when they mention how strong you've been. You try not to flinch when they say, he probably wasn't right for you anyway. And maybe they're right. Maybe he wasn't. Maybe you romanticize the whole thing. Maybe love isn't supposed to be a series of ellipses and postage delays. But in that moment, the moment you said goodbye at the station, or the dock, or the steps of your father's townhouse, it felt real. It was real. And that's the cruel part. Because your feelings were honest, and his were time-stamped. You wonder what became of him. If he thinks of you, if he tells his wife about the girl who used to send him silly poems and worry about the weather, you'll never know, because Victorian love stories don't always end in reunions. Some end in silence. Some end in return addresses that never write back. Some end in letters folded carefully, then hidden at the back of a drawer until the paper yellows and the ink fades. And some never quite end at all. They just stop, mid-sentence, mid-feeling, with no full stop. The world moves on. The seasons change. You're expected to find someone else, as if affection is something that can be reassigned like a library book. And maybe you do, but you don't forget. Because there's a part of you still standing at the post, still scanning the horizon, still listening for footsteps that no longer echo. And that part, the one who waited, never really leaves. It wasn't a dramatic ending. No scandal, no public betrayal, no weeping at train stations or shouting in the rain. Just life. It moved on. And so did you. Sort of. You never married, or you married someone else. The right someone, the practical someone, the someone your family approved of. You told yourself it was time to grow up. That real love was stability, not longing. But every once in a while, at a concert, in a crowd, across a ballroom lit by flickering gas lamps, you see them. Just for a second. They haven't changed as much as they should have. Or maybe they have, and your memory's just stubborn. They look at you. You look back. And it's as if someone has opened a door in a house you bricked up long ago. Everything returns. The letters, the glances, the time you touched hands under the table and acted like it was an accident. The ache is quiet, polite, fully corseted, but it is there. You nod across the room. They nod back. And that's all. Because it has to be. You're someone's spouse now. They might be too. You have a household to manage, nieces to impress, a reputation to maintain. There's no room in the drawing room for what could have been. And yet, your heart still folds slightly in on itself when you see them. You'd thought time would dissolve it, that the years would file it down into something neat, forgettable. But it stayed. It lived beneath the sewing patterns and garden parties. It hummed through anniversaries and obligations in the slow, steady march of becoming someone else. Not all love ends loudly. Some of it just sinks, heavy, intact, beneath the surface, where no one can touch it, but you always know it's there. You shared something once. You were something once. Maybe it never even fully happened. Maybe it was all almosts and near misses and unfinished sentences. But that doesn't make it less real. It just makes it harder to explain. Because how do you confess to a memory that still blushes? How do you say, I remember everything, when the polite thing to do is forget? You try not to dwell. You remind yourself, that was a long time ago. People change. Love isn't everything. But the truth is, it never really left. It just learned to blend in, to sit beside you at dinner and say nothing, to stand behind you in the mirror and smooth your collar, to wait quietly while you smile at someone else. And sometimes, late at night, after the house is quiet and the fire's gone low, you think about how easily it could have gone another way. If they'd spoken sooner. If you'd been braver. If your father hadn't intercepted that letter. If life had been just slightly more generous. But it wasn't. So you make peace with what you had. With the half story. The unwritten ending. The private ache dressed up as composure. You tell yourself you're lucky. And in many ways, you are. You have a life. A name that carries weight. A household where your opinion matters, at least most days. Maybe even a husband who tries, in his own fumbling, quiet way, to be kind. But nothing ever made you feel like that. Nothing ever rewrote the tempo of your heartbeat the way they did. And so you live with it. This quiet truth. This small, tender betrayal you carry against no one but fate. You never speak of it. You couldn't, even if you wanted to. There are no words in Victorian English for, I almost lived a different life. But when you see them again, decades later, hair graying, posture stiffer, still beautiful in that maddening, unforgettable way, you feel it in your throat, in your chest, in the way you suddenly forget the name of the person you were just speaking to. They glance at you. They know. You both do. There's no scandal in it now. No risk. You're just two people at the end of a very long story, staring into a chapter that was never written. Maybe you exchange a word or two. Maybe you don't. Maybe the silence says more than anything else could. But that glance, That pause in the middle of a perfectly normal evening is enough to pull you back through every door you ever closed. And when it passes, when the music starts up again and the moment slips back into memory, you carry it with you, not like a burden, like a thread, one that never frayed. Because not all secrets are shameful. Some are just yours, too private for public consumption, too sacred to give away, too real to forget. And in the end, you realize something rather Victorian in its irony. The love you buried beneath duty, silence, and decades was the only one that never disappointed you. You read Jane Eyre by candlelight and swore you'd never settle for less. Not after Mr. Rochester. Not after Reader, I Married Him. You thought love would arrive cloaked in intensity. A gaze across the moors, a trembling hand. A man so overcome by longing that he forgets social protocol and shouts your name into the night. Instead, you got Mr. Whitaker from your father's parish, who blinks too much, asks after your embroidery, and once compared you to his aunt as a compliment. There is no grand declaration. There is no burning mansion, just tepid conversation and tea that's never quite hot enough. Welcome to Victorian reality, where fiction lied to you, gorgeously, seductively, and often. Where novels promised drama and yearning and devastating monologues, and real life gave you awkward silences and emotionally stunted men with weak chins. You were taught to read between the lines of Dickens and the Brontes, to believe in tension that simmered just beneath the surface, to interpret every pause, every half glance, every skipped heartbeat as meaning. Then you entered society and discovered that most of the time, a pause is just a pause, and the only thing simmering is the overcooked pudding. You dreamed of passion. Instead, you rehearsed small talk. You practiced smiling with restraint. You nodded as men explained your own opinions back to you. You read about lovers who risked everything for one stolen kiss. You got a hand pat and a second cup of tea if you were lucky. In fiction, men fall to their knees. In life, they fall asleep mid-conversation. And still, you clung to the novels, because they gave you something society never did: permission to feel. Books let you imagine what couldn't be spoken aloud. They let you believe there was more out there than duty and property and gloved restraint. You underlined the passionate parts. You dog-eared the chapters where women made bold choices and survived. Even if you knew deep down that boldness in real life came at a cost, that no one would rescue you from your own attic, that being mysterious only worked if you were rich, thin, and recently orphaned. Still, you hoped, because hope is what fiction gives you, and what real life slowly takes away. With a smile and a calling card, you practiced looking mysterious at parties. You lowered your lashes like they did in the novels. You waited for someone to notice the poetry in your silence. Instead, they asked whether your aunt was still recovering from gout. You realized that in real life, people don't say what they mean. They hint, they nod. They compliment your hair ribbon and hope you understand this means marriage is on the table. You wanted heat. You got subtlety. The kind of subtlety that could be mistaken for indifference, boredom, or indigestion. And yet, you never fully let go of the stories. Because even when they misled you, even when they built expectations no one in your actual postcode could ever meet, they gave you an inner life. They reminded you that passion existed, even if it wasn't spoken, that you were capable of deep feeling, even if you could never confess it out loud. They made you ache, in a good way, a way that made you feel alive, even as everything around you demanded stillness. And so, you became two people. The one who smiled politely at Mr. Whitaker, and the one who imagined telling him off in dramatic fashion, book in hand, voice trembling with righteousness. You mastered the art of internal rebellion, of looking calm while your thoughts galloped like a Bronte heroine in a storm. Sometimes, fiction was the only thing that made you believe you hadn't gone mad, that it wasn't normal to feel nothing, that maybe, just maybe, your disappointment wasn't your fault, that maybe the world was simply too small for the size of your heart. You learned to translate your longing into acceptable forms. You wrote poetry and called it literary practice. You stared out windows and claimed to be thinking about the weather. You lived a love story entirely in your mind, because that was the only safe place to keep it. And you weren't alone. All around you were women with the same glazed smiles and hidden pages. Women who had read Persuasion and Wuthering Heights and Middlemarch and come away both nourished and betrayed. Because the books made it seem possible. That love could be something more than a negotiation. That it could be felt fully, not just performed. But in the parlor, in the real world, love was delicate, conditional, wrapped in etiquette and spoken in code. No one wanted to hear about fire. They wanted grace. They wanted modesty. They wanted you to look serene while your insides curled into knots. And if you didn't, well, perhaps you'd been reading too many novels. Perhaps you were sensitive. Perhaps you needed to get out more. So you learned to nod at the right times, to temper your hopes, to let fiction live where it belonged, in private. But sometimes you wonder what would have happened if you'd taken the stories literally, if you'd stood in the rain and confessed, if you'd followed your heart, not your chaperone, if you'd believed the pages more than the people. Maybe you'd have made a mess of things. Maybe you'd have ended up alone. Or maybe, just maybe, you'd have felt something that wasn't choreographed, something that didn't fit between the lace gloves and dinner bells. You'll never know. But the novels, they stay on your shelf, by your bed, inside your chest, quietly whispering, there was more. You knew it. It wasn't grand, not the way they wrote it. There were no dramatic speeches on staircases, no declarations over candlelight, no mad gallops across moors with a heart full of risk and rain. It wasn't safe either. To feel too much was to risk too much. Your reputation, your future, your family's standing, even your health. They swore too much emotion could trigger hysteria. And it certainly wasn't fair. Not when he could call it a youthful mistake, and you became a cautionary tale. Not when entire households arranged your destiny before you ever spoke a word. Not when society punished you for longing, and then mocked you for not being loved. But it was real, even if you couldn't say it out loud. Even if it had to live in coded glances, borrowed books, and letters you never sent. Love, in Victorian times, learned to survive inside the silence. It wore gloves. It kept its voice low. It smiled when it wanted to scream. It didn't always bloom in marriages. In fact, it rarely did. Some women fell in love with someone they could never have. Some married someone they never loved. And some loved quietly from the sidelines, content with a memory or a friendship or a half-finished what if. There was no permission to love freely, but still, people found ways. They carved small spaces for it inside lives ruled by duty. A single pressed flower, a hidden photograph, a book passed hand to hand with a note scrawled in the margins. It wasn't cinematic. It was careful, sometimes cowardly, sometimes brave in a way no one ever saw. And yet, it changed everything. Because even when the world told you that marriage was business and feelings were impractical and your job was to smile and obey, you still felt something that didn't fit inside a corseted script. Maybe it lasted a season. Maybe it lasted decades. Maybe it never happened at all, but you imagined it late at night and woke up with your heart aching. And that was real too. Victorian love didn't announce itself. It didn't arrive on horseback. It lived in subtler places, between the lines, behind closed doors, beneath polite conversation. It took root in quiet rebellion, in stolen glances, in decisions that looked small from the outside, but carried entire lifetimes inside them. Sometimes it ended in ruin. Sometimes it never had the chance to begin. And sometimes, rarely, it endured. But whether it was requited or not, whether it fit inside society's rules or exploded just outside them, love left marks, invisible ones, the kind that don't fade, because to feel something deeply in a world that punishes depth is an act of defiance, and to carry it with grace without letting it crush you is a quiet kind of power. So no, it wasn't a fairy tale. There were no perfect endings, only imperfect people trying to love in impossible circumstances. But if you listen closely, beneath the rustle of taffeta and the clink of teacups, you can still hear it. The heartbeat of someone who dared to feel, who dared to hope, who loved someone they maybe never even touched. And that was everything. If you're still awake, you've just spent the last few hours tracing the soft, fraying edge of what it meant to fall in love in the Victorian era. And maybe, just maybe, something in it felt familiar. Maybe you've loved like this, or waited like this, or written a letter you never sent. Maybe you've stood in a room full of people and still felt entirely tethered to someone who wasn't there. Victorian love wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself with fireworks or parade banners. It slipped in quietly, uninvited, unforgiving, and it stayed. Even when it couldn't be returned, even when it had no place to go, even when the rules said it shouldn't exist at all. That's the thing about love, it doesn't care much for etiquette. It arrives inconveniently, lingers unfairly, and teaches you everything by breaking all the things you thought you knew. And yet, you endure. You fold the feeling into your life like a pressed flower in a book, hidden, flattened, and still beautiful. So no, your name may not appear in a history book, but the way you felt, that was real, that mattered, even if it only existed in the margins. History might have ignored those small, quiet loves, but they were there. They lived behind drawn curtains and inside unsent letters and across ballrooms where no one dared to speak first. So now, rest. You've carried enough feelings for one night. The fairy tale never mattered anyway. It was always the secret, stubborn love, the quiet one that no one saw coming, that changed everything. And if nothing else, you made it through Victorian courtship without fainting, sobbing, or being carted off for emotional hysteria. That's a triumph. Sleep well, you poor sentimental thing. We'll uncover more forgotten stories. Next time. Good night.